Imagine watching your closest friends get plucked off the deck of your ship, one by one, lifted, screaming up into the air, calling your name, reaching down for you to save them. And you do nothing. You keep your hands on the oar. You row right past it because you already understood this was the price, and you paid it on purpose. Because there was no good way through. On one side of the narrow channel, a thing waited that could swallow the whole ship in a single gulp. Every soul aboard, gone in a heartbeat. On the other, something faster that would only take a few. And the water was too tight to escape them both. So, the cleverest man alive had to do the coldest math there is. A handful of his crew, or all of them. He would carry what happened in that channel for the rest of his life. He called it the most pitiful thing he ever saw in all his years at sea. And the worst part is, he saw it coming. Let me tell you this story from the Odyssey. He had just gotten his men past the sirens, and before he could even breathe, Circe's last warning was waiting for him, and it was the worst one of all, because this one had no clean way out. Ahead of them was a narrow strait, a channel of water with death waiting on both sides of it. On one side, high up in a cliff, lived a monster named Scylla. And Scylla was an absolute nightmare. She had 6 long necks and a horrible head on the end of each one, and 3 rows of teeth packed into every mouth. She lived on a cave in the rock face, and when a ship passed below, she struck down and snatched sailors right off the deck, 6 men at a time, 1 for each head, and then ate them. And here's the part that takes away our last hope. She could not be killed. She could not be fought. She wasn't an enemy you could beat. She was a fact of the place, like the cliff itself. And directly across from her, close enough to hit by throwing a stone, was the other side, Charybdis. Now, Charybdis was a whirlpool, but not like anything you've ever pictured. 3 times a day, it opened a huge black throat in the sea and sucked the entire ocean down into it, then roared it all back up again. Anything caught near it when it pulled, a ship, a crew, all of them, was simply gone, swallowed whole in one breath of the sea. And the channel between them was too narrow to avoid both. So Circe had given Odysseus the coldest piece of advice anyone has ever given. Don't try to fight Scylla, she told him, and whatever you do, don't steer away from her, because the other way is Charybdis, and Charybdis takes everyone. Scylla only takes 6. 6 dead is better than all dead. So hug the monster's cliff, row hard, let her take her 6, and do not stop, because if you stop to fight, she will only come back and take 6 more. Now, sit with that math for a second. The best possible outcome, the smart move, the right call, was to knowingly feed 6 of his own men to a monster. Now, this strait actually gave us a phrase people still use without knowing where it came from. When someone is caught between 2 equally terrible options, we say they're stuck between Scylla and Charybdis, the original rock and a hard place. Except here, both the rock and the hard place want to eat you. And Odysseus did one thing Circe told him not to. She said, "Don't even bother arming yourself. It's pointless. You can't fight her." And he couldn't accept that. He couldn't stand the idea of just standing around while his men were taken. So he strapped on his armor, picked up 2 spears, and stood on the deck ready to fight a thing he'd been told could not be fought. He knew it wouldn't help. He did it anyway. But there's one thing he decided not to do, and it's the hardest thing in the whole story. He decided not to tell his men about Scylla. Now, he warned them about the whirlpool. Row hard, stay tight to the far side, don't let us drift. That much they needed to know. But about the monster overhead, about the 6 men she was going to take, he said nothing, not a word. Because he understood his crew. If he told them that 6 of them were about to be plucked off the deck and eaten, they would panic. They'd drop their oars, they'd scramble below deck to hide. And a ship that has no one rowing drifts straight into Charybdis. And then, it isn't 6 who die, It's everyone." So he carried it alone. He looked at his men bending over the oars, and he already knew that 6 of them were as good as dead. They went into the strait, and Charybdis was there. They watched it open. They watched the sea get dragged down into that black mouth, down and down, until they could see the bare rock and the dark sand at the very bottom of the world. And the water bellowed like a wounded animal. It was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever laid their eyes on, which is exactly why every man on that ship was staring at it. And that is when Scylla came. While every eye was locked on the Whirlpool, a monster struck down from the cliff above, silent, unseen, and in a single heartbeat, she plucked 6 men off the deck. Odysseus heard them before he understood. He looked up, and he saw the worst thing he would ever see. 6 of his best men, friends who trusted him, lifted high into the air, twisting and kicking, screaming his name, stretching their hands down toward him. And Scylla, pulling them up to her cave, the way a fisherman flips little fish off his hook and swallows them. They called for him by name, right to the very end. And there was nothing he could do. Nothing. He just had to keep his hands on the oar and row. He said later that in all his years on the water, in everything he ever suffered, that was the most pitiful thing he ever saw. 6 men screaming his name, and the only way to save everyone was to keep rowing and let them die. If a story like that can put that kind of weight in your chest, you already know what to do. Subscribe and stay with me to the end. And then they were through. The strait fell away behind them. The ship was whole. The crew was alive, except 6 of them who never knew the danger and never had a chance to face it. Now think about what really happened in that strait. We always want the hero to draw his sword and kill the monster. But Scylla couldn't be killed. The strait wasn't a battle. It was a sum. And the bravest thing Odysseus did in that channel wasn't to fight, it was to not fight, to accept something no one should ever have to accept, that to save the many, he had to spend the few, knowingly, in silence, and then live with it. This is not the kind of courage anyone writes a song about. There is no glory in it. He didn't beat anything. He just made the only choice that didn't end with everyone dead. And he made it alone. And he paid for it with 6 men he had known and led and was responsible for. He saved the ship, but he chose the 6, and he would hear them calling his name for the rest of his life. That's the part nobody tells you about being the one in charge. The math always works out. Lose 6, save the rest. But it never works out for the person who had to do the adding. The strait closed up behind them. The sea went quiet. The crew bent back to the oars and pulled for open water. And at the benches, 6 places sat empty. And the man at the helm said nothing about why, and he never would. There was no good way through, only the least terrible one. He saved the ship, and he carried the sound of those 6 men calling his name for the rest of his life. If you know someone who's had to make an impossible call, the kind nobody else will ever fully understand, share this video with them. And right now on your screen is the entire Odyssey saga, every chapter in one place. One of my favorites comes next. One last island, covered in golden cattle, a prophet warned them never to touch, and a crew slowly starving who knew the price and reached for them anyway. Start from the beginning or keep going from here. Click it right now, and I'll see you in the next story.